Have you ever wondered who you truly are beneath the labels, beneath the masks, beneath the stories you've told yourself all your life? What if I told you that the greatest enemy you face isn't out there, but within, that the voice in your head whispering, "I am right," might be the very force keeping you trapped in suffering? This is the untold story of the ego. It often begins quietly, almost imperceptibly. A feeling, a tension, a subtle defensiveness in your chest when someone disagrees with you. A flare of annoyance when your idea isn't recognized. That sinking sensation when you're criticized. We brush it off. We call it personality. But what if it's something deeper, more insidious? What if this is the whisper of the ego, the false self that quietly runs our lives? In today's story, we dive into the hidden layers of the ego, inspired by the profound teachings of Buddhist monk and mindfulness teacher, Master Min. But this isn't just about Buddhism. It's about you, me, all of us. It's about reclaiming control over the inner world that too often controls us. Let's be clear. The ego is not evil. It's not a villain twirling its mustache in the background. In fact, it began as a mechanism to help us survive, to differentiate me from you, to build a sense of self, to navigate the complexities of life. But over time, what was once a tool has become a tyrant. We began to identify with it. We say, "I am angry," but anger is just an emotion. You are not anger. We say, "I am worthless," but worthlessness is a thought. You are not that thought. We say, "I am successful," but success is a condition. You are not a condition. The ego thrives on attachment to roles, identities, opinions, stories. It says, "This is me," and if you threaten that, if you challenge a narrative, I feel attacked. And when I feel attacked, I defend, I push, I fight, I suffer. In a society that glorifies individualism, achievement, and personal branding, the ego is no longer just tolerated, it's celebrated. But this celebration comes at a cost. We see people burned out, anxious, obsessed with validation. Our self-worth is tied to likes, follows, paychecks, titles. But the more we chase, the emptier we feel. Why? Because the ego cannot be satisfied. No amount of success, recognition, or control will ever be enough for it. It's like trying to quench thirst by drinking salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. We live in a world where everyone is shouting, "See me!" But beneath the noise is a silent desperation. Please, love me, accept me, tell me I matter. I remember the first time I realized I was living through my ego. It wasn't a spiritual retreat or a grand revelation. It was a simple argument with someone I love. I felt attacked, misunderstood, and immediately my instinct was to defend myself. I began forming counter-arguments in my head while they were still talking. I wasn't listening, I was preparing to win, because the ego doesn't seek truth. It seeks victory. Afterward, I sat alone, and a question came to mind. Why do I need to be right so badly? The answer was uncomfortable. It wasn't about the issue. It was about my identity. My ego had made being right part of my self-worth. Losing the argument felt like losing a part of me. That was the moment I began to wake up. In Master Min-Neem's teachings, he points out something radical. The ego borrows everything. It borrows your name, your gender, your job, your past experiences. It says, "This is me." But what happens when those things are taken away? If you lose your job, are you still you? If your partner leaves, who are you then? If no one praises you, do you still feel valuable? When we identify with the ego, we set ourselves up for suffering, because all external things are impermanent. Jobs end, relationships change, status fades. But your true self, your awareness, your presence, your consciousness that is untouched. The ego resists this truth. It clings. It fears death, not just physical death, but the death of its identity. That's why spiritual awakening often feels like dying, because something is dying the illusion of who we thought we were. We all have two voices inside us. One says, "They disrespected you. You better show them who's boss." The other whispers, "Let it go. Their behavior doesn't define you." One says, "You failed. You're a loser." The other asks, "What can you learn from this?" The first voice is the ego. The second is the soul. The battle isn't external. It's within. And every day, we choose which voice to feed. The first step to freedom is awareness. Just seeing the ego is powerful. The moment you observe it, you're no longer fully identified with it. You're creating space between the thought and the thinker. That's where mindfulness comes in, not as a trendy practice, but as a lifeline. It's not about sitting in lotus position for an hour. It's about noticing your reactions, becoming curious instead of judgmental, asking, what am I defending here? What fear is hiding beneath this anger? Every moment of irritation is a doorway to deeper self-understanding. Every conflict is a mirror, reflecting the parts of us that are still unconscious. Every criticism is an invitation to question whether we're truly free or just reacting from a wounded self. In this first chapter, we've only scratched the surface. We've begun to see the contours of the ego, how it operates, how it deceives, how it dominates. But this is just the beginning. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into how the ego shapes our relationships, how it manipulates our sense of worth, and how to begin dismantling its grip over our lives. The ego is a wonderful servant, but a terrible master. This old saying rings truer than ever. The sun was just beginning to set on the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the temple courtyard. A soft breeze stirred the prayer flags, and the old bell echoed gently through the silence. Inside the meditation hall, the monk's voice was calm, yet firm, slicing through the illusion of self like a blade of wisdom. You are not who you think you are. These words weren't meant to sound mysterious. They were an urgent call to awaken. For centuries, human beings have been prisoners locked not by iron bars or stone walls, but by an idea so seductive and persistent that we take it for truth. That idea is a self. From the moment we are born, we begin to construct an identity. We are taught to say, I, me, mine. We learn our names, roles, and stories. We start to believe, I am this body. I am these thoughts. I am my past. I am my achievements. But these beliefs are just masks stitched together by memory and desire. The self, as Buddhism teaches, is not a fixed thing. It is a flowing river, not a solid rock. Yet we cling to it like it's real. And this clinging creates suffering. Have you ever felt insulted, even when no one said your name? That's the ego reacting. Have you ever felt superior when praised, or crushed when criticized? That's attachment to the self-image. This illusion runs deep. We become addicted to a sense of I, even though we can't clearly define it. The ego is clever. It doesn't just wear one mask. It hides behind many. The mask of achievement, I am what I do. The mask of relationships, I am my role of parent, a lover, a leader. The mask of intellect, I am what I know. The mask of identity, I am my culture, race, gender, beliefs. But what happens when these are taken away? A man once lost his job and spiraled into depression. He said, I don't know who I am anymore. But was he ever truly that job? A woman went through a divorce and cried, "I feel invisible." But had her value really disappeared, or just her image? These crises can be blessings in disguise. They force us to ask the uncomfortable but liberating question. Who am I, really? There's a voice in your head. It narrates your life endlessly judging, comparing, fearing, desiring. That voice is not your enemy, but it isn't your essence either. It's the echo of your conditioning. In deep meditation, you begin to notice something. You can watch the voice. You can observe your thoughts and emotions. If you can observe them, you are not them. You are the awareness beneath the noise. This awareness is peaceful. It doesn't cling. It doesn't grasp. It simply sees. It is like the sky, vast, still, and untouched by the clouds it passed through. When we identify with awareness rather than ego, suffering begins to fall away. We suffer not only because of who we think we are, but also because of what we think we own. We say, my body, my time, my success, my opinion. But everything we own is temporary. The body ages, time slips away, success fades, opinions change. The more tightly we hold on, the more pain we invite. Have you ever noticed how quickly joy turns into fear? The moment we get something we love, we fear losing it. That fear is the shadow of attachment. It's not love, it's possession. Letting go doesn't mean we stop caring. It means we stop clinging. The ego thrives on comparison. It always wants more beauty, more success, more recognition. In the age of social media, this disease has worsened. We scroll through endless images of perfect lives and feel inadequate. But we're comparing our behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel. The truth is, no two paths are the same. You are not in a race with anyone. The flower does not compete with the tree. It simply blooms. The first step to freedom is awareness. Notice when your ego is triggered. Notice when your mind says, I'm better or I'm not enough. Don't fight it. Don't judge it. Just observe. Every time you catch the ego playing its games, you take a step out of its grip. You begin to see clearly, I am not this thought. I am not this fear. I am not this mask. You are something deeper, vaster, more peaceful. There was a time when I mistook ambition for identity. I chased titles, praise, and status. But with every success, I felt emptier inside. Until one day, I sat in silence, and for the first time, I listened, not to the world, but to the silence behind my thoughts. In that silence, I realized I had never truly met myself. It wasn't a moment of mystical light. It was just a quiet understanding. I am not what I thought I was. That realization didn't erase all my struggles, but it changed how I faced them. From then on, life became less a performance and more of a practice. This path isn't easy. The ego resists. It will shout, argue, distract. But every time we return to awareness, we weaken its control. It's not about destroying the ego, it's about seeing through it. Bit by bit, the illusion fades and the light of truth begins to shine. And what is that truth? That beyond the idea of me, there is peace, there is love, there is freedom, and it has been here all along, waiting for you to remember. You are not the wave, you are the ocean. You are not the thought, you are the awareness behind it. The air was heavy with silence, and the monk's voice returned calm, measured, as if unveiling a secret buried for centuries. The ego is not born from strength. It is born from pain. Those who appear the strongest on the outside are often the ones who have been hurt the most on the inside. But rather than face the wound, we build walls. We put on masks. And before we know it, the mask becomes our identity. This is the beginning of the false self. Think back to your earliest memories. Before language, before logic, just raw emotion. A child is not born with an ego. A child becomes egoic by absorbing the reactions, judgments, and expectations of the world around them. A child cries, and the caregiver says, "Stop crying. Be strong." A child expresses anger, and they hear, "That's bad. Don't be angry." A child longs for attention but is told, "You're too much. Be quiet." In these moments, the child doesn't just suppress the emotion, they suppress a part of themselves. They begin to believe, if I want love, I must hide who I am. Thus begins the fragmentation of the self. Some parts are labeled acceptable. Others are exiled into the shadow. And from this split, the ego is born. To survive, we create a persona, a mask we wear to win approval and avoid rejection. Some become the achiever. If I'm perfect, I'll be loved. Some become the caretaker. If I please everyone, I'll be safe. Some become the rebel. If I push back, I'll stay in control. These roles are not who we are. They are strategies born from pain. But the tragedy is this. After playing a role for so long, we forget it's a performance. The mask fuses with the skin. The actor forgets to play. Inside every adult, there's a child still waiting to be seen. Not the child that smiles in the photo albums, but the one who cried quietly when no one was watching. The one who held their breath to avoid conflict. The one who danced freely until someone laughed. This inner child holds the original wound. And until we meet them with compassion, we will continue to act from that pain no matter how old we are. Have you ever overreacted to a small comment or felt abandoned even when no one left? That was not your adult self reacting. That was a child inside you whispering, "Please see me. Please don't leave me again." The ego cannot bear vulnerability, so it builds a fortress. It blames others to avoid guilt. It distracts to avoid silence. It controls to avoid chaos. It judges to avoid self-reflection. But all these defenses come at a cost: connection. You cannot receive love if you are armored. You cannot find peace if you are constantly protecting an illusion. And so, the ego becomes both our prison and our warden. I remember wearing a mask of the strong one. I was always the one with the answers, the one who never cried, the one who smiled even when it hurt. But behind that mask, I was exhausted. I was waiting for someone to say, "You don't have to be strong all the time." That moment didn't come from the outside. It came one night in stillness, when I finally whispered to myself. That night, I met the child within me, not to fix him, but to listen. And in that moment, something softened. The mask began to crack. Healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means reclaiming the parts we abandoned. It begins with awareness, noticing when you are reacting from pain rather than presence. It deepens with compassion, speaking to yourself with a kindness you never received. And it blossoms with integration, becoming whole again. You cannot hate the ego into disappearing. You can only outgrow it with love. There's a simple truth. What you do not feel, you cannot heal. We avoid pain because we fear it will consume us. But in reality, the pain we resist grows stronger in the shadows. It becomes anxiety, depression, rage, numbness. But when we turn toward it gently, patiently, it begins to release its grip. Tears may come, memories may surface, but each wave is part of cleansing. Behind the grief is love. Behind the fear is freedom. We have lived too long with stories like, "I'm not enough. I must earn love." If I'm vulnerable, I'll be hurt. But these are not truths. They are scars, and scars can fade. You can write a new story, one where worth is not conditional, one where presence matters more than performance, one where love begins within, not outside. This journey isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. Beneath the ego, beneath the wounds, there is a self untouched by pain. That self doesn't need to be good enough. It is enough. The return to that self is not a destination. It is a daily practice, a daily homecoming. And every time you pause, breathe, and listen within, you take one step closer. The ego screams for attention, but the soul waits in silence. The ego doesn't want peace. It wants control, even if that control creates suffering. As the monk's voice continued, the room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls of our own minds were closing in. Control. That word echoed like a chain being pulled taut. We like to believe we are free, but the truth is more uncomfortable. Most of us live not by choice, but by reaction, not from awareness, but from programming. And the one pulling the strings is the ego. The ego does not dwell in your heart. It operates from the shadows of your mind, always calculating, always comparing, always craving. You walk into a room and the voice begins. They're looking at you. Don't say that. They'll judge you. You're not as smart as them. Prove yourself. Be liked. Be right. It never stops. The ego doesn't speak in words of wisdom. It speaks in whispers of fear, in shouts of insecurity, in the heavy silence of shame. You think it's your voice, but it's not. It's the voice you absorbed, echoes from childhood, from society, from wounds. And you obey it like a slave, not knowing you've been shackled. The ego has two hands, and it grips reality with both. One hand is craving. I must have this. I need it. Without it, I'm nothing. The other is aversion. I must avoid this. I hate it. If it happens, I'll fall apart. These two hands drag you through life like a rag doll, never present, never free. You crave success. You fear failure. You crave love. You fear rejection. You crave control. You fear uncertainty. But in chasing and resisting, you never rest. You're always running, always bracing for the next hit. This is not life. This is survival. The ego doesn't love. It needs. It seeks validation, not connection. It listens to reply, not to understand. In relationships, it says, you complete me. You owe me. Don't leave me. Prove you love me. But this is not love. This is emotional transaction, a bargain born from insecurity. And when the illusion cracks, when the other fails to meet the ego's demands, resentment grows. Love turns into manipulation. Care turns into control. Attachment turns into poison. The ego doesn't want intimacy. It wants possession. But the soul only wants to be seen. The ego survives by clinging to identity. I am successful. I am a victim. I am better. I am broken. Whether the label is positive or negative, the ego feeds on it because labels give the illusion of stability. But what happens when that identity is threatened? When the job is lost? When the role changes? When someone challenges your beliefs? The ego panics. It attacks. It defends. Because without identity, the ego fears death. But here's the paradox. You were never that label to begin with. You are not your job. You are not your past. You are not even your thoughts. You are the space beneath all that, the awareness watching it all unfold. Why do we argue with strangers online? Why do we fight over small things in relationships? Why do we feel so personally attacked when someone disagrees? Because the ego equates being wrong with being unworthy. It says, if they win, I lose. If I'm wrong, I'm nothing. And so we defend opinions like sacred relics. We fight not understand, but to protect our fragile self-image. But in truth, being wrong is not a threat, it's an opportunity to grow, to expand, to become less rigid, less trapped. The ego fears this, but the soul welcomes it. Control is the ego's favorite drug. It wants to control the outcome, control people, control the narrative. But here's the brutal truth. Control is an illusion. You can't control what others think of you. You can't control whether life will throw chaos at your door. You can't control how the story unfolds. But you can control how you meet it, with resistance or with surrender, with fear or with presence. The ego chooses resistance, but the soul flows like water. There was a time I couldn't sit still in silence. Silence made me feel exposed. So I filled my life with noise, tasks, distractions, goals. It gave me the illusion that I was in charge. But deep down, I was terrified of stillness. Because in stillness, I had to face the one thing I avoided most myself. The turning point came not in a grand revelation, but in a breakdown, when everything I tried to control fell apart, and in the ruins, I found peace. Not because I fixed everything, but because I stopped trying to control it all. I breathed, I wept, I surrendered, and for the first time in years, I felt free. You cannot kill the ego. That's just more ego. You observe it. You name its patterns. You meet its fear with compassion. And slowly, like a wound exposed to sunlight, it begins to soften. You stop reacting. You start responding. You stop clinging. You start flowing. You stop pretending. You start being. The ego shouts. The soul whispers. Who will you listen to? Pain is inevitable. But suffering is the ego's favorite meal. There's a quiet horror in realizing this. We don't just experience suffering. We cling to it. We identify with it. We feed on it. It becomes a story we tell the world. Look at my pain. This is who I am. And the ego smiles in the shadows. Because as long as you suffer, it survives. It begins innocently. You scroll through your phone. Someone got promoted. Someone got married. Someone's child won a trophy. Someone's life looks perfect. And without even thinking, your mind whispers, I'm behind. I'm not good enough. They're winning. I'm losing. Comparison is the ego's poison. Because no matter how good your life is, it will find someone doing better and whisper that you're less. You become trapped in invisible wars you never agreed to fight. Wars of image, wars of success, wars of perfection. But here's the truth. You're comparing your behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel. And the more you compare, the more the ego tightens its grip. Pain happens. We all get hurt. But there's a difference between feeling pain and becoming it. The ego loves turning wounds into identity. I'm the one who was betrayed. I'm the one no one understands. I'm the one always left behind. There's a strange comfort in being the victim. It absolves us of responsibility. It makes us feel special. It gives us a story, but that story becomes a prison. Because while you're busy replaying the past, you're blind to present. While you're waiting for an apology, you miss the peace that comes from releasing. While you cling to the hurt, you lose the chance to heal. Some people don't know who they are without their pain. Ask them to describe themselves, and they'll list every heartbreak, every failure, every trauma. Their pain has become their name tag. It's not their fault. The ego builds its throne on our deepest wounds. Because when we're hurt, we're vulnerable, and the ego promises strength. Never trust again. Always be on guard. Don't forgive. They don't deserve it. But that strength is brittle. It's a shield that keeps love out. It's armor that traps the soul. True strength isn't defense. It's the courage to let go. The ego has a rule book for life. If I work hard, I should succeed. If I love someone, they should stay. If I'm good, bad things shouldn't happen. But life doesn't follow the ego's rules. And when reality breaks the ego's expectations, it cries, "This isn't fair." But fairness is a human construct. The universe is not a courtroom. It's a river. It flows, sometimes calmly, sometimes violently, not because you're good or bad, but because that's what rivers do. Resisting the flow only drowns you deeper. When something goes wrong, the ego asks, "Whose fault is this?" And it starts pointing fingers. Your parents, your partner, your boss, your past. But the more we blame, the less power we have. Because blame gives your peace to someone else. It says, "I can't be happy unless they change." And that is the perfect trap. The ego doesn't want peace. It wants control masked as justice. But healing isn't about proving others wrong. It's about choosing freedom whether or not they ever apologize. Have you noticed? Peace feels boring to the ego. It craves intensity. It wants something to be wrong. It feeds on emotional storms. That's why silence feels uncomfortable. Why stillness feels empty. Why some people pick fights just to feel alive. Drama becomes a drug. And the ego is the dealer, whispering, "This matters. Make it big. Don't let it go." But it's a lie. Peace isn't boring. It's just unfamiliar. The ego fears it because in peace, the ego disappears. There was a time I thought suffering made me deep. I wore my pain like a badge. I believed if I stopped hurting, I'd lose something precious. It took years to realize. Suffering isn't depth, it's residue, and I was confusing unhealed wounds with wisdom. Real depth comes from transmutation, from turning pain into compassion, from seeing clearly and still choosing to love. When I began releasing my need to suffer, I feared I'd become shallow. Instead, I became whole. You cannot escape suffering by fighting it. You dissolve it by seeing it for what it is. A teacher, a signal, not a home. You breathe through it. You feel it fully. You let it rise and let it pass. And in its place, something quiet emerges. Not happiness, exactly, but peace. The kind of peace that doesn't depend on external things. The kind that says, "I am not my pain. I am the one who witnesses it." Your suffering is not a life sentence. It's a doorway. Walk through it. Most relationships are not between two people, but between two egos fighting for survival. It's a truth we don't want to admit. We believe we love. We believe we care. We believe we give. But often, our love is conditional, tied to expectations, anchored in roles, driven by the ego's deepest fear. If I'm not needed, I'll be forgotten. We enter relationships hoping to be understood, to be seen, to be heard, to be held. But the ego twists this desire into demand. Validate me, reflect my worth, make me feel whole. And when the other person fails, as they always will, eventually, the ego turns cold. Love becomes a transaction, a scoreboard, a weapon. We begin to keep tabs. I did this for you. Why didn't you do the same? I changed for you. Why won't you change for me? And in that moment, love dies, replaced by contracts. In relationships, we become actors, the devoted partner, the responsible parent, the obedient child, the nice friend. These roles may look noble, but often they're cages. We perform instead of connect. We please instead of speak truth. We pretend instead of feel. The ego doesn't care if the role is painful, only that it's familiar, because the familiar feels safe, even if it's killing us slowly. And so we stay in broken dynamics, not out of love, but out of identity. The ego cannot stand rejection. It treats it not as a moment, but as a verdict. They left me, so I must be unlovable. They ignored me, so I must be invisible. We carry the scars of old rejections into every new bond. Every silence feels like abandonment. Every disagreement feels like betrayal. And so, we either shrink to avoid conflict or explode to avoid pain. But both are defenses, not love. Love says, I want you to be free. But the ego says, I want to own you. Jealousy isn't about the other person. It's about the ego's fear of not being special. Control isn't about care. It's about the terror of unpredictability. We check their phone. We monitor their tone. We try to shape their choices. But deep down we know, if someone has to be controlled to stay, they're not really staying. And if we have to shrink ourselves to keep someone, then we've already lost ourselves. The ego doesn't like feeling small, so it uses tools to feel big. Guilt, silence, sarcasm, blame. These are the weapons of unconscious love. We say, if you love me, you'd. We sigh loudly instead of speaking. We punish with withdrawal. We provoke with passive aggression, not because we're evil, but because the ego is scared. Scared of being unworthy, scared of being left, scared of being wrong. But fear dressed as love is still fear. What does love look like without ego? It listens without defending. It gives without keeping score. It stays without clinging. It sees without projecting. Love without ego doesn't mean becoming passive. It means becoming present. It means setting boundaries with kindness. It means expressing truth without punishment. It means letting people grow even if that growth takes them away from us. This kind of love is rare, not because it's impossible, but because it requires us to die to everything false, to let go of needing to be right, to surrender the urge to win, to stop proving and start being. I once believed love meant sacrifice, that if I gave enough, bent enough, stayed quiet enough, I'd be loved in return. But I wasn't loving. I was bargaining. I wasn't showing up as myself. I was showing up as a version I thought they wanted. And slowly I disappeared, until one day I realized, if I have to abandon myself to be loved, that love is mine to keep. You can't fix a relationship by changing the other person, but you can transform it by meeting yourself. When you become aware of your ego in the relationship, you stop reacting and start responding. You recognize when you're projecting. You own your patterns. You take responsibility for your wounds. And slowly, the dynamic shifts. Maybe they change. Maybe they don't. But either way, you're no longer chained to the outcome. Here's a hard truth. Some people come into your life to mirror your wounds, not to stay forever. They reflect your fears, your habits, your blind spots. And once you've seen them, once you've learned, it's okay to let them go. The ego will scream, "You failed, you wasted time." But your soul will whisper, "You grew, you awakened." That was the point. Not every love story ends in a fairy tale. Some end in freedom. Real love isn't about holding on tighter. It's about holding yourself more gently. In a world built by egos, to be authentic is an act of rebellion. Every day, we walk into a battlefield, not with swords, not with guns, but with masks. We put on the smile, the confidence, the charm, the image, because in society, value is rarely measured by truth, but by perception. The ego craves status, not for the sake of power, but for the illusion of importance. We chase promotions, luxury, recognition, followers, fame, not because they fulfill us, but because they silence the fear. If I don't stand out, I'll disappear. We live for applause but die in silence. We compare salaries instead of souls. We trade time for titles. And we forget that the ladder we're climbing may be leaning against the wrong wall. Society defines success in numbers. How much do you earn? How many people know your name? How many boxes have you checked? But this definition is not truth. It's consensus illusion, created by millions of egos agreeing to play the same game. You may own mansions, but be empty inside. You may lead thousands, but be lost yourself. You may look like a god, but feel like a ghost. And yet, the ego says, just a little more fame, more likes, more status. But there's no finish line on this race, only exhaustion. Social media is ego's playground. We don't post reality. We post strategy. We curate highlights. We filter flaws. We market a version of ourselves, more like a brand than a being. And in doing so, we begin to believe the mask. We forget who we were before performance. We become strangers to our own reflection. But here's the twist. Everyone is doing it, so no one knows who's real anymore. We're trapped in a mirror maze of projections, pretending, performing, and quietly falling apart behind the screen. Ego is seductive when given authority. In leadership, it often masquerades as confidence, but its true form is control. The ego doesn't want to serve. It wants to rule, to dictate, to manipulate, to win. When leaders are driven by ego, people become tools. Nations become pawns. Truth becomes a casualty. We've seen it across history. Empires rise on the wings of ego and collapse under its weight because ego builds monuments to itself, but forgets the foundation is humanity. From childhood, we're taught to compare. Who scored higher? Who ran faster? Who got picked first? The ego feeds on this. It doesn't need to be great. It just needs to be better than you. And so, we grow into adults who see life as a contest. Colleagues become rivals. Friends become benchmarks. Neighbors become threats. But here's the irony. The more we compete, the more we disconnect. Because the ego doesn't build bridges. It builds pedestals and trenches. The ego doesn't just live in individuals. It lives in groups, tribes, nations, religions, cultures. We cling to flags and anthems, not always out of love, but out of fear. If I'm not part of something bigger, I am nothing. But this collective ego can be dangerous. It breeds superiority. It justifies violence. It glorifies history while ignoring wounds. True pride lifts others, but ego pride suppresses them. And when we wrap ego in patriotism, we begin to confuse dominance with dignity. At the core of all this noise is a quiet, aching voice. Am I enough? We work ourselves to death, dress to impress, lie to fit in, hustle to be seen, all because we fear the silence, the stillness, the possibility that we don't know who we are without the game. But what if you stopped? What if, for one moment, you laid down the mask, stepped off the stage, let the applause fade? Would you still recognize yourself? I remember sitting in a meeting. Everyone was smiling, nodding, playing their roles. But I felt like I was drowning in plastic. The conversation was about goals, targets, achievements. But no one asked, how are you really? In that moment, I saw it clearly. I was not a person. I was a projection. And I realized if I died tomorrow, the version of me they mourned would be a role I never truly lived. That was the day I decided. I'd rather be real and rejected than adored for a mask. You don't have to quit society to transcend ego, but you do have to wake up, question the game, challenge the norms, refuse to play small to fit in, be excellent, but not to prove your worth, be visible, but not to validate your ego, succeed, but not at the cost of your soul. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs more authenticity. And every time you choose to show up as yourself, you weaken the grip of ego on the collective. You were not born to compete. You were born to create. When ego enters a relationship, love becomes a transaction, not a transformation. Have you ever said or thought, you belong to me? They're mine. I deserve better. These aren't words of love. They are the whispers of ego. True love sees the other as free, but ego sees them as property, not a person, but an extension of me, a trophy, a reflection, a possession. And this is where suffering begins. Because once ego takes hold, love is no longer about giving. It's about controlling. The ego doesn't love you. It loves what you do for it. It craves the attention, the validation, the comfort of being chosen. It will say, I love you, but mean, I need you to make me feel whole. So when your partner disappoints you, criticizes you, ignores you, or loves you imperfectly, the ego doesn't forgive. It fights. It withdraws. It punishes. Because to the ego, pain is betrayal. Disagreement is rejection. Honesty is threat. When two egos date, love becomes a game. Who gives more? Who cares less? Who texts first? Who wins the argument? It's no longer about connection. It's about leverage. And so, couples who once shared dreams start trading resentments. They build scoreboards. They weaponize silence. They perform instead of speak. Until one day, they realize they've stopped loving and started negotiating. Ego doesn't spare families. It shows up in generational pride. Our name must be protected. You must succeed because I failed. Don't embarrass this family. Here, love is conditional. Acceptance is based on performance. And identity becomes inheritance, not choice. Many children grow up not knowing who they are, only who they're supposed to be. They live their parents' unfulfilled dreams, their ancestors' unresolved traumas, and lose themselves in the echo of obligation. Even friendships aren't safe. The ego wants to be the funniest, the most admired, the one everyone comes to for advice, the one with more success. And if a friend surpasses us, we feel a sting we can't explain. It's not jealousy, it's ego loss. Because friendship built on ego is not about companionship, it's about comparison. When your ego is involved, you don't celebrate your friends. You measure yourself against them. So what does ego-free love look like? It's not perfect, but it is free. Free of ownership, obligation, performance, manipulation. It's a love that sees, accepts, and supports without needing to win. A love that says, I see you as you are, and that is enough. That kind of love heals, not because it fixes the other, but because it lets them be. Ego always comes with a script. You should text me back. You should know what I need. You should never change. But the shoulds are cages. They suffocate love. They demand perfection in an imperfect world. And when people fail to follow our script, we punish them with guilt, with distance, with silent treatment. But real love doesn't hold people hostage to our needs. It says, I won't leave you for failing to be perfect, because perfection is the ego's fantasy, not the soul's truth. Relationships are mirrors. They don't just show us who the other is. They show us who we are. If you are constantly angry, jealous, or insecure, it may not be the other person. It may be your ego reacting to being seen, because nothing threatens the ego more than vulnerability, accountability, being truly known. The ego wants to be admired, but not understood, because understanding requires removal of the mask. In every conflict, the ego chooses sides. It turns love into a courtroom. You hurt me. You always do this. You never listen. But real healing begins when one person stops playing judge and starts being present. Instead of defending yourself, ask, what pain in me is reacting right now? Instead of attacking them, ask, what fear are they hiding beneath that anger? In doing so, you win the war of me versus you, and step into the world of us. The most powerful relationships are not built on control. They're built on curiosity. Who are you really? Who am I becoming when I'm with you? What are we here to grow into? These questions can't be answered with ego, only with openness, because love is not a transaction. It's a transformation. You don't find the right person. You become the person who can love without ego. Ego says, I want you to change. Love says, I'm willing to change with you. Wake up, check phone, scroll, compare, envy. You haven't even brushed your teeth, and already your ego is whispering. You're behind. Look at them. You're missing out. You're not enough. This is not coincidence. This is programming. The ego survives by making you feel lacking, because a person who feels whole cannot be controlled. The ego never rests. It always moves the finish line. Got a promotion? Now get the title. Got the body? Now get the attention. Got the partner? Now keep proving you're worthy. And so the chase continues. Faster, harder, lonelier. We don't live. We perform. We don't rest. We hustle. We don't appreciate. We upgrade because the ego doesn't want peace. It wants more, always more. Try this. Sit in silence for 10 minutes. No phone, no music, no distractions. Most people can't. Why? Because when everything goes quiet, the ego gets loud. It brings up regrets, insecurities, fears, doubts. It tells you, you're wasting time. This is uncomfortable. Do something. Be someone. Fix yourself. And in that moment, you realize the ego fears one thing above all, the present moment, because in the present, There is no past to regret, no future to control, no identity to maintain. There is only being. And to the ego, being is terrifying because it cannot possess being. It can only pretend. Most anxiety is not caused by life. It's caused by the stories the ego tells about life. What if they leave? What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? The ego spins possibilities like spider webs, and you, stuck in them, mistake fear for preparation. But fear is not preparation. It is paralysis. You're not protecting yourself. You're punishing yourself. And the worst part? 99% of what you fear never even happens. But the ego wins either way, because it keeps you small. Here's what ego truly costs you: sleep, peace, health, presence, gratitude, joy, connection, creativity, life itself. All for what? A self-image that crumbles with one insult, a success that leaves you emptier than before, a status that fades the moment you stop performing. This isn't freedom. It's a prison with golden walls. And many people spend their whole lives decorating their cell instead of walking out the door. Ego is a master disguise. Sometimes it looks like confidence, but it's insecurity. Kindness, but it's manipulation. Success, but it's desperation for approval. Strength, but it's fear of vulnerability. And so we become performers in our own lives, smiling when we're breaking, achieving when we're dying inside, posting happiness while drowning in loneliness, because the ego fears one thing above all: being seen, truly seen. And when someone sees through the mask, we either run from them or run to them, depending on whether we're ready to heal. Peace begins the moment you stop trying to be someone, not because you give up, but because you finally wake up to this truth. You are not your achievements. You are not your body. You are not your job. You are not your followers. You are not your trauma. You are not your past. You are the awareness behind all of it, the one who watches, the one who listens, the one who is aware of the ego, and therefore not the ego. When ego dies, something amazing happens. The voice of fear goes quiet. The need to prove disappears. The compulsion to compare fades. And what rises is presence, simplicity, contentment, joy without reason, gratitude without achievement. This isn't boredom. It's freedom. This isn't failure. It's awakening. This isn't giving up. It's coming home. You don't need to fix the world before you find peace. You need to fix your relationship with yourself, because the war you fight on the outside is often a reflection of the war you've ignored inside. End that war, and the world will change without you lifting a finger, because peaceful people create peaceful homes, peaceful communities, and peaceful legacies. Ego screams for attention. The soul whispers peace. You must die before you die, so that you may truly live. Sufi proverb. The ego clings to one illusion above all, that it is in control of how others see us, of how life unfolds, of what should or shouldn't happen. But what happens when life doesn't follow the ego script? When love leaves, when failure hits, when illness knocks, when death whispers, the ego panics. It fights. It resists, because to lose control is to face the one thing the ego cannot bear, the unknown. But what if the unknown isn't something to fear, but something to trust? Surrender is not defeat. It's the highest form of strength. It's saying, I don't need to control everything. I don't need to be perfect. I don't need to know what's next. It's trading anxiety for presence, arrogance for humility, fear for faith. When you surrender the ego's need to dominate life, you finally begin to dance with it, like a river flowing effortlessly, instead of a dam resisting every wave. Every person has a story, but the tragedy is this. Most people become prisoners of their story. I'm the victim. I'm the achiever. I'm the one who was hurt. I'm the one who always proves others wrong. These identities become cages, comfortable but suffocating, and the ego guards them like treasure, because if you let go of the story, who are you? You are free, not bound by past, not limited by future, just alive now. This is what happens when the ego dies. You no longer seek validation. You no longer compete. You no longer chase worthiness. You no longer fear silence. Instead, you listen deeply. You love without agenda. You create without fear. You rest without guilt. You become a mirror, reflecting truth instead of projecting pain. You become a space where others feel safe to be themselves. You become real. We live in a world obsessed with image, but what it truly needs is authenticity. Not more people trying to win, but more people willing to wake up. Not more noise, but more presence. Not more ego, but more soul. So when you choose to let go, when you stop reacting, proving, performing, you don't become weak. You become dangerous. Dangerous to illusion, to manipulation, to systems built on fear. Because you become someone the world cannot control. Someone who no longer fears death. Because they've already let go of everything fake. Behind the ego's armor, behind the layers of pain, fear, and story, there is something untouched, something timeless. Call it consciousness, call it presence, call it soul, call it God. It doesn't matter the name. What matters is, it's you, the real you, the one who's been watching, waiting, whispering through intuition, silence, dreams. It's time to return home. So how do we live this way? Not just as an idea, but as a practice. Here are 5 paths. Mindfulness. Observe your thoughts without attaching to them. The moment you see the ego, you disarm it. Stillness. Spend time in silence. The ego cannot survive where there is no noise. Service. Help others without needing recognition. The ego wants credit. The soul wants to give. Truth. Speak honestly, even when it's hard. The ego hides. Truth heals. Gratitude. Give thanks, even for the small things. Gratitude dissolves ego like sunlight melts fog. You don't lose anything real by letting go of ego. You lose fear, insecurity, arrogance, envy, pride, shame, loneliness, and you gain freedom, peace, joy, love, clarity, compassion, presence, power. Not power over others, but power within yourself. You are not here to win a race, or wear a crown, or prove anything. You are here to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. That child, that soul, that spark, it's still in you. And when the ego dies, it comes alive. Ego death is not the end of you. It is the end of who you are not. If this journey stirred something within you, don't let it fade. Take a moment, pause, reflect, and ask yourself, where my life is ego stealing my peace? What would my life look like if I didn't need to prove anything? Who could I become if I let go of the story? Then share this message with someone you love, someone who needs this, someone ready to awaken. Because the more we heal ourselves, the more we heal the world. Let go, wake up, live free,